good to see everyone. I just want to know before I get started if everyone's going to the Glenn Beck rally at Safeco Field on Saturday. I want to warn you, bring umbrellas. Even if they close the dome, he's going to be crying. I fear for my country. I really do. And I'm glad everyone is safe from the roving bands of Obama youth who were indoctrinated before this talk. So anyway, we're here to talk about my book, Republican Gomorrah, which is sort of just packaging of 6 years of research and reporting that I've done on the Christian right and the radical right, the movement that I can think controls the Republican Party. And most of the conventional histories of this movement begin with the Goldwater campaign in '64, but my history actually begins in the Armenian genocide, in the oldest Christian country in the world, where the Rushdoony family fled from the town of Van as the Turks moved in and massacred everyone. And a young boy named R.J. Rushdoony was taken to California with his family, with his parents. He was the descendant of 6 generations of high priests in Armenia. And he viewed the Armenian genocide as proof that secular civilization was fallen and that man was doomed unless he could restore the kind of Calvinistic biblical society that his ancestors taught him about. So he started, after finishing theology school, writing these tracts, including this one 700-page book called The Institutes for Biblical Law, that provided a blueprint for replacing secular government, for replacing the United States Constitution with biblical law, which meant that the church would replace road building, all the functions of the federal government, schooling, healthcare, influencing the right with this libertarian strain, but at the same time a totalitarian influence, because Rushdoony advised that the church, through Leviticus case law, replaced the criminal justice system so that disobedient children, blasphemers, adulterers, witches, abortion doctors would all be executed, perhaps by firing squad, which you could call the Christian right's trigger option. Rushdoony's son-in-law, Gary North, who is an economics advisor to Ron Paul, the Republican presidential candidate, advised killing evildoers with stones because stones are cheaper. He's an economist. And, Rushdoony's very controversial. If you ask people within the Christian right if they've ever read him, they're going to deny it out of pocket. But he gave them the blueprint. I mean, he established the whole homeschooling movement and gave them the blueprint for the society they hoped to create, even if it was going to be in a diluted form and wasn't going to be the hardcore theocracy that he advised. But who gave the Christian right its tactics, moving from Armenia to another unlikely place? I go to the Swiss Alps in the 1960s to a hippie commune where a Christian theologian named Francis Schaeffer was was holding these all-night lectures with the Jesus freak movement. Kids from the United States would come there, of all persuasions, including openly gay kids, and he would lecture them on John Cage, on Pablo Picasso, and how it all played into Christianity and his view of the Bible. Timothy Leary visited him there, the LSD guru. Jimmy Page, the guitarist for Led Zeppelin, was seen with a copy of one of Schaeffer's books in his back pocket. Bono from U2 says Schaeffer's one of his favorite writers. But when the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down by the Supreme Court, Schaeffer was radicalized. He believed, for whatever reason, that the U.S. government had just legalized infanticide and would implement something along the lines of death panels. He actually said that. This is where it all comes from. And so he went to Washington, this really brilliant theologian who is becoming popular among the ranks of evangelical youth at Wheaton College in California and elsewhere. And he convinced the Republican leadership there, the moderate Republican leadership, Gerald Ford, he impressed upon them the importance of abortion, of opposing abortion. He also, while he was dining with Gerald Ford at night, he was also meeting with people like Jerry Falwell, who had traditionally been obsessed with opposing racial integration. That was the only thing that could get Jerry Falwell fired up. You know, he denounced Martin Luther King in 1954, actually, for being political, and he called him a communist traitor. Paul Weyrich, you know, the Catholic right operative, went down to Virginia to meet with Jerry Falwell and said, I couldn't get him into this abortion thing. You know, all he wants to talk about is the blacks coming into his private Christian schools. But Schaeffer told Falwell, the way that we're going to unravel secular society is through abortion and by using the tactics of Martin Luther King. But actually, by the end of his life, in the early 80s, Schaeffer was advocating domestic terrorism. He said we need to use force in the defensive posture, in other words, in the defense of fetuses, to stop abortion. He wound up spawning groups like Operation Rescue, which was responsible for the killing of Dr. Tiller most recently in Kansas, and at least indirectly responsible for dozens of murders of abortion doctors and attacks on abortion clinics in the 90s. And I'm friends with Schaeffer's son, Frank Schaeffer, and you know he's written some reviews of my book saying it was dead on. And he is sort of speaking from the grave for his father, because his father, at the end of his life, while he was dying of cancer, wanted to denounce the Christian right. He saw them becoming power mad, and he hated their homophobia. He actually kicked Anita Bryant out of his hospital, away from his deathbed while he was dying, because she asked for his consent and support for her to pursue, you know, the anti-gay crusade in Florida. But it was too late. Schaeffer died, and the Christian right moved into Washington with the Reagan Revolution, with Reagan declaring to Falwell and a group of ministers, I know you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. All along, while Schaeffer was lecturing, there was a silver-haired, bespectacled man with a sweater in the back of the auditorium. He was a child psychologist named James Dobson, who was watching Schaeffer carefully. And he got to know Schaeffer casually, and Schaeffer despised him. But that didn't matter, because he wanted to continue this legacy. By now, I consider James Dobson, even though he's very old, the most powerful figure in the Christian right. He was probably most responsible of any movement leader for the re-election of George W. Bush in 2004 and for the really radical Republican Congress. But Dobson isn't a religious figure, even though he's leading a religious movement. He has no theological credentials. He has no theological training. He's a child psychologist. And the reason why I focus on him in my book is because I think, you know, besides his political power, more than anyone in the movement, he has cultivated the sensibility of the movement that controls the Republican Party. And you can look at his first book, which is a best-selling book. It sold millions, been reprinted several times, Dare to Discipline, as a document of this sensibility. What is Dare to Discipline? Well, it was left for my parents by an evangelical au pair after taking care of me for a year as a gift. My parents had reared me along the lines of Dr. Benjamin Spock, who is Dobson's arch enemy, and also was attacked by the right. Spiro Agnew called him the father of permissiveness. And so what Dobson wanted to do through this child-rearing manual, Dare to Discipline, was to roll back the 60s and restore in children respect for authority and God. Actually, Dare to Discipline, I still need that cup holder, is a manual for sadomasochism. Dobson says, the child should be spanked with sufficient magnitude to make him cry. Then you should welcome him. He will want to crumple to your breast, and you should welcome him with warm and loving arms. Now, what is that? Hitting and loving at the same time. It's sadomasochism. And I know that sounds funny, or I'm being extreme. But in selling millions of this book and financing this huge empire that he wanted to build, Dobson created a belt-wielding army of millions. He raised up the radical next generation of the Republican Party. Now, when I mentioned sadomasochism, I used that term. That term was originally discussed by a psychologist named Erich Fromm, who inspired a lot of the ideas behind my book. He says sadomasochism isn't just a sexual kink, even though some Republican figures like Ted Haggard and possibly David Vitter have participated in real sadomasochism. And he defines it as a symbiosis of sadism and masochism. The sadism comes from the drive to beat down those who you perceive as weaker than you, minorities, homosexuals, foreigners, the poor, and at the same time to prostrate yourself before a higher force, a powerful leader, even a magic helper, someone like George W. Bush, who is a strong leader, someone like James Dobson, but who is the ultimate, magic helper, who is the ultimate strong leader. It's the Jesus of Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, the ultimate sadomasochist. Mark Driscoll, local guy here, I don't know if anyone knows him, the hipster pastor. He took a nightclub and turned it into a church, and this is a really burgeoning church. He says Jesus was not some Richard Simmons hippie queer Christ or a long-haired, effeminate-looking dude. He was ultimate fighting Jesus, a terminator of machismo with calloused hands and big biceps. Another figure who's been really popular in the Christian right, who's inspired this bizarre model of Jesus Christ, who's anything but the Prince of Peace in the Bible, is John Eldredge, who is a former Focus on the Family counselor with Dobson. He fuses into Christianity a neo-pagan strain and says Jesus was actually William Wallace, the figure from Mel Gibson's Braveheart movie. I'm going to just read from my book, since I have a little bit more time here, and talk about John Eldredge. He's a reformed druggie who discovered Francis Schaeffer in his 20s and later went to work as a counselor for Focus on the Family. Eldredge wrote the men's movement's seminal tract, Wild at Heart. This book, which has sold over 2 million copies since it was published in 2002, called for men to model themselves after a hybrid of ultimate fighting Jesus and William Wallace, the virile Scottish separatist leader romanticized in Mel Gibson's movie Braveheart. Eldredge's Superman was the very antithesis of the Prince of Peace. He works with wood, commands the loyalty of dock workers, Eldredge wrote. He is the Lord of hosts, the captain of angel armies. And when Christ returns, he will be at the head of a dreadful company, mounted on a white horse, with a double-edged sword, his robe dipped in blood. Now that sounds a lot more like William Wallace than it does Mother Teresa. No question about it, there is something fierce in the heart of God. White supremacists around the globe shared Eldredge's reverence for Wallace. William Pierce, the deceased Idaho-based neo-Nazi leader known as the Farm Belt Führer, upheld Wallace as a model of personal sacrifice. That, I think, is one of the strongest things in our people and is something we need to call on and recognize, Pierce said. And for more people to be willing to do whatever is necessary, as William Wallace was. The Italian neo-fascist Umberto Bossi, who, while serving as reform minister to Silvio Berlusconi, proposed torpedoing boatloads of African migrant workers before they reached Italian shores, proudly adorned a wall of his office with a poster of Wallace. Meanwhile, back in Wallace's homeland, the Scottish Sunday Mail reported, hate-filled Nazis are using Braveheart fever to recruit Scots. They urge people who want to do something about the browning of our country to watch Mel Gibson's movie about Scots patriot William Wallace. And most recently, through my friend Dave Nywert, who's here, who blogs at Orsinus and Crooks for Liars, I learned that La Familia, one of the top narco-terror gangs in Mexico, is distributing, its leader is distributing copies of Wild at Heart to his followers, and he's using evangelical religion to galvanize his followers into this cult-like gang. And they go out, and when, besides killing their enemies, as they did in Uruapan, Michoacan, when they chopped off the heads of 5 rival drug dealers and left them on the dance floor at a club, they go on morality crusades and attack and kill homosexuals. So the sensibility of the Christian right, Focus on the Family, by the way, broadcasts in Spanish in Mexico, in countries all over the globe, and that's probably how Eldredge arrived there. But this sensibility is being globalized, this sadomasochistic sensibility. I want to just give a little more Seattle history here. Ted Bundy is a local Seattle guy. He used to work. Sorry? Well, he seemed to be going somewhere for a while. And he was working actually at a rape crisis hotline in Seattle and helped. He produced some booklets informing women how to avoid being raped or picked up by hitchhikers. Really interesting story. He was also a moderate Republican operative who had put on disguises when he worked for the campaign of former Washington State Governor Dan Evans. He'd wear a wig and mustache, and he'd go into rallies of his opponent, Albert Rossellini, with a camera. This is 1972, before anyone thought of this. And he'd film Rossellini using different accents before different audiences. You know, he'd use a phony rural accent in front of a rural audience. And then they produced these commercials showing Rossellini as a, phony limousine liberal. It was devastating, and Evans wound up winning. He made Bundy his personal driver, allowed him to babysit his kids, and Bundy became close friends with the assistant director of the state Republican Party. He was actually awarded Mr. Republican, I think, in '74. He wound up using those same disguises to capture and kill possibly 130 women. While he was in jail, Bundy became captivated with the Meese Commission pornography report, which James Dobson and a panel, including some very interesting figures from the Christian right, produced. This 1,000-page report, which included very explicit descriptions of pornographic movies that read like sort of just really clinical penthouse forum letters, recommended that the government ban vibrators and ban pornography, etc. Dobson became Bundy's hero, and Bundy planned one last publicity coup. This pathological liar gave Dobson his last interview before being executed, and planned to tell Dobson, and did tell Dobson, that he became this pathological serial killer because he had seen Playboy magazine images as a kid. Actually, he was viciously abused as a child, and so many of the people who have wound up at Dobson's feet have been abused as a child, just as Dobson was. He brags in Dare to Discipline about how his mother would beat him with a girdle, and yearns for a time when Farmer John could take his son out to the back 40 and set him straight. So this was probably, what started it with Bundy. But Dobson took Bundy at his word and declared, after this exclusive interview, while all the rest of the press waited outside, that if Ted Bundy's going to hell, so are we. Then he promptly sold tapes of his interview to the media on the condition that they air them for an hour, unexpurgated, unedited, on national TV. And he sold tapes to his followers for making $1 million profit. Vaulting himself onto the national stage and making a fortune. When controversy ensued, he donated all that money to, he said, charity nonprofits, which are actually anti-abortion groups affiliated with his political empire. This bizarre relationship with the serial killer, the killer and the saint in the valley of death, is what vaulted Dobson onto the national stage. Soon, tapes of another video that Dobson produced called Where's Dad were circulating among congressional Republicans in the early 90s. And one of the guys who saw one of these tapes was Tom DeLay, who was known as Hot Tub Tommy when he was in Texas. He was, he's a lot like Two-Step Tommy, the kind of disco weirdo you saw on Dancing with the Stars. He lived in a place called Macho Manor with a bunch of bachelors, even though he was married, and he would have rowdy sex with women other than his wife. He was a drunk. And he was also going nowhere with his political career because he had no connection to the movement that was controlling the Republican Party. He was primarily just obsessed with stopping the ETA because he was the EPA because he was an exterminator. Through Dobson, Hot Tub Tommy transformed into the Hammer and wound up overthrowing Newt Gingrich, digging up information on Gingrich, and forcing Gingrich to resign after Gingrich pursued the impeachment of Bill Clinton while he was having an affair with a woman 20 years his junior who was on the congressional payroll, after leaving his second wife on her hospital bed. And he had actually, when he married her, he had left his first wife while she was recovering from cancer surgery. So Gingrich was not exactly beloved by the Christian right. And DeLay was installed with Dennis Hastert as his puppet. And they produced the most corrupt Congress ever. So, I talk about a lot of the corruption, a lot of the casino schemes that DeLay cooked up with Jack Abramoff and how they corralled all these Christian right leaders, including Dobson, into them. And so with DeLay facing money laundering charges in Texas and his popularity declining in his own district, at the time when it looked like he would even lose to a Democrat in Sugar Land, Texas, one of the most Republican districts in the country, he and Dobson throw themselves into the Terry Schiavo charade and try to save the life of this woman who is essentially brain dead. I had just moved to Washington at the time, and I went to a conference, a Christian right conference that DeLay spoke at, where he said the judges need to be intimidated because this was right after Terry Schiavo was taken off her feeding tube. A judge, a Florida Circuit judge named George Greer, who was a Republican appointed by Bush, I think, had made the decision. And I was outside this conference with a guy named Michael Schwartz, who's the chief of staff to Senator Tom Coburn, the Republican from Oklahoma, and he said to me, I'm a radical. He didn't know I was a reporter. He just thought I was a Republican because I look like this. I'm like just a white guy. And he said, he starts foaming at the mouth, and he said, I'm a radical. I'm a real extremist. I don't want to impeach judges, because everyone inside was talking about how to impeach judges. I want to impale them. And this is at the time when Judge George Greer was under police guard. And that night they had a ceremony, a banquet. And Terry Schiavo's lawyer comes up and says, she was actually alive, and she would speak to me. It was bizarre. And then at the end, some pastor asks everyone to get on the floor and pray for Terry. They called her Terry as if they knew her. And so I'm on the floor in a place just like this, and all these adults wearing suits are on the floor, and they're praying. And a pastor begins praying that Judge George Greer would be sent to hell so that his flesh be devoured by Satan. And I look to my left, and I see the gigantic posterior of former Congressman William Dannemeyer, who had who had written a letter with 12 names of people who had died from non-natural causes at the hands of Bill Clinton when he was in Congress. And to my right, one of the few people not sit on the floor was Phyllis Schlafly, and her thighs were this close to me. I could have bit them. It's funny, but this is when I knew that the Republican Party had been captured by this movement, and it was going to implode very soon, because the mainstream America finally saw what the Christian right was about, how unconstitutional they were. And the press had been derelict in reporting on this, but finally they were reporting because the Republican leadership was echoing, the most hysterical cries from their base. And then suddenly, the perfect storm for the destruction of the Republican Party, bizarre scandals exploding into the open. The Party of Family Values is revealed as America's largest walk-in closet with Larry Craig, Ted Haggard, and Mark Foley. And, we all know about those scandals, and we maybe know the details. But what I try to do in my book is to get behind the details and even beyond the hypocrisy argument that just because Ted Haggard was lobbying Bush to pass anti-gay legislation and then wound up in the arms of a studly male escort with a nose full of methamphetamines, that he was a hypocrite. There's more to it. There've been more scandals since my book has come out. Most recently, this low-level Michael Duvall in California, the spank master, who is on a microphone, on an open committee microphone, talking about spanking a female lobbyist. All these scandals stem from the same pessimistic view of the self that the Christian right has, this Calvinistic idea. John Calvin said, he wrote once, he was looking at a baby in a crib, and he saw the baby seething with sin. It's the idea that the self is inherently dirty, and by doing what God supposedly wants them to do, the macho God of this William Wallace character, they can somehow transcend the self. Listen to Mark Sanford's press conference announcing his affair with his Latin lover, which he had on state money. He said, and the press never picked up on this, we follow God's law because it restrains the self from the self, and the self is the most selfish self of all. It was a bizarre statement, but I understood it to be exactly what I just said. John Ensign, the only Pentecostal in the Senate, far right-wing senator from Nevada, in this hand-scrawled letter that he wrote to his mistress, Cindy Hampton, who is a paid congressional staffer, which looked like actually like a hold-up note written by a committee of Ted Kaczynski and Ted Haggard. He said, "The reason why I had this affair with you and why we did this is because I walked away from God." In other words, he started relying on his self, his individual will. Mike Huckabee, on the campaign trail in 2007, this is in a campaign speech. He said, "Man does not have a God nature. Man has a sin nature." Go on and on with people who've said stuff like this, who are major Republican figures. But it illustrates that they're using politics and religion as a form of medication for their anxiety and what lurks inside the self. Because when they do what the self wants to do, when they do what they want to do, they tend to do some pretty freaky stuff, and they admit it. These scandals were at least partly responsible for the Republicans losing 6 Senate seats and over 30 seats in the House in 2006. And Karl Rove said as much. He said, it's depressed the turnout from our base, the base that I built to bring Bush into the White House in 2004. So we move into the 2008 campaign with the Republican Party on the ropes, with the Republican brand extremely damaged by DeLay's Congress and by Dobson's party. And, out of nowhere, Mike Huckabee emerges. He's a close friend of Dobson. He had very little money in the campaign. He'd been written off. He's a close friend of Dobson. He says his favorite book is Francis Schaeffer's Christian Manifesto, where Schaeffer recommends force in the defensive posture. And he gives a speech in Iowa for some of the most politically active pastors in the state. And he says, "My father was the most patriotic man I ever knew. He laid on the stripes and I saw stars." And the crowd rises to its feet and cheers. And those people go out and they work their asses off for Huckabee, and they send their congregations out to vote for him. And Huckabee defeats Mitt Romney, who is spending $8 million a day on advertisements in Iowa, handily. So what happened was Huckabee and Romney split the conservative base because Romney, who was overcompensating, wound up going for the Christian right as a Mormon, which couldn't work. And that cleared space for John McCain to emerge. The Republicans in the end decided to vote tactically because they thought that McCain would be the only one who could defeat either Hillary or Obama. But McCain was despised by the Christian right. Dobson went on his radio show and said, "I cannot vote for John McCain, but we'll be watching. We'll be watching to see which vice president he picks." And, behind the scenes, James Dobson was corresponding with this self-described hardcore prayer warrior and pro-lifer in the wilds of Alaska. And he sent her a letter commending her for having what he called that little Down syndrome baby and not aborting it because it was a statement of her values. And he was at least, he was pretty influential in promoting Sarah Palin to the Republican grassroots. Because John McCain was despised by the movement that controls the party, Sarah Palin, as bizarre as she may seem to many of you, was the only logical choice for the Republican vice presidential candidate. And Dobson, as soon as Palin was picked, gave a full-throated endorsement to John McCain on his radio show and urged everyone to vote for him. And that was across the board in the Christian right. At that point, they were confident about the Republican ticket. When I was in Alaska a year ago, and I'm going up on Saturday, I had gone up there to see a guy named Bishop Thomas Muthi speak. He is a self-described witch hunter from Kenya who claimed to have driven the witches out of his hometown of Kiambu, Kenya. And he was preaching at Sarah Palin's church of 20 years, the Wasilla Assembly of God. And I was just kind of screwing around on the internet the night before I was, before he was going to speak, and I found a video of him anointing Sarah Palin in 2005 at her church with his laying hands on her, anointing her against the spirit of witchcraft. This was the kind of person they picked, and at that point I had questions about Sarah Palin. Perhaps she'd been proving herself as a pretty effective attack dog against Obama. Maybe I shouldn't underestimate her. Maybe she wasn't Dan Quayle in a skirt. But after I saw this, it was pretty clear that she was going to, first of all, invigorate the base more than George W. Bush had and shatter the party. She believed her church believes in a theology called third wave, which is possibly more radical than what I talked about before, the dominionism of Rushdoony. They believe that places and people can be possessed by demons, and that those demons need to be purged out through ceremonies. Ted Haggard also believed in this and was seen in Colorado anointing intersections with a bottle of Crisco and a garden sprayer. I think this place would be sort of an epicenter of demonic possession right now. And beyond that, Palin was the archetype of the right-wing woman. I think she was mocked by the press because she was for abstinence, only education, but her daughter, 16-year-old daughter, was pregnant. But if you look at the facts on the ground in Palin country, you'll see why so many people, especially women, identified with her. For example, if you look in Lubbock, Texas, where abstinence-only education has been mandated since 1996, and Lubbock has this double the rate of gonorrhea infections among adolescent girls. Or if you look at a congressional survey called Ad Health, showing that evangelical adolescent girls lose their virginity at an earlier age than any other demographic except for black Protestants. Or if you look at a study by sociologists Peter Bierman and Hannah Bruckner showing that girls who participate in purity balls and lay white flowers at the feet of crosses, pledging to stay pure until marriage, 50% of them are deflowered within 2 years. These are the facts on the ground in Palin country. It's why so many people identify with her in a way that transcends ideas, that transcends politics, and that transcends ideology, and is so personal. And so when Palin came to town in rural Pennsylvania, for example, which James Carville says there's Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Alabama in between. People would come out and they would flock there, fill the rallies in much larger numbers than they would for John McCain, and they'd prostrate themselves at her naughty monkey heels because she was lifting them from the drudgery of their lives. She was a magic helper, someone providing them with symbols and a glorious cause that went far beyond the McCain campaign. When they said she had gone rogue, what she had done was she had made herself into a folk hero. And Obama became the target of the sadism that would give her followers and the Republican base this feeling of euphoria of kicking down the evildoer. And at the same time, she helped them experience the masochistic part of the symbiosis I talked about before. They felt this sense of community, like they were together while the media was attacking them and mocking them. And so Palin went off script and called Obama a terrorist. She said, "He's not one of us." McCain never approved these attacks. And meanwhile, Obama was trying to be the great uniter, a community organizer. And he thought perhaps after the campaign was over, these people would come around and support health care. Maybe if he had Rick Warren speak at his inauguration, he could mollify them. No. There's a connection between the Palin rallies and the Glenn Beck rally at Safeco Field. It didn't stop with the campaign. It only intensified because they are totally out of power and they can only throw rocks at the institutions of power. They're back where they started, and in that respect, they're increasingly dangerous. And any hint of compromise eradicates the psychological motive that they have for this fervent activity. It destroys the sense of community they feel. It destroys the euphoria they get from kicking down evildoers. Newt Gingrich said it himself. He said, "I think you can write a psychological profile of me that says I found a way to immerse my insecurities in a cause large enough to justify whatever I wanted it to." And Newt Gingrich has seconded Sarah Palin's conspiracy theory that Barack Obama's health care plan contains a provision for death panels, or Hitler's T4 program for euthanizing the mentally retarded and elderly. And this is what the party's become. The congressional Republican approval rating right now is 7% in the northeastern United States. It's 20% in the Midwest, and here and in other parts of the West, it's also 20%. But in the Deep South, it's 60%. It's the party of Joseph Wilson. It's the party of "you lie." It is a party that can no longer hold power on a national level. it's gone from Eisenhower's big tent party to Sarah Palin's one-ring circus. Now, while I was writing my book, I discovered a letter that, an obscure letter in the Eisenhower archives that he had written to a military veteran from World War II who was dying of pancreatic cancer. The veteran had said, we seek a leader who gives us, statements of total security and assuredness, and you seem to be wavering and relying too much on nuance. It seemed like he was calling for a leader more like George W. Bush or Sarah Palin, an authoritarian, strong leader. And Eisenhower could have just tossed the letter away, but he decided to use this as an opportunity to expound on his vision of the open society. Eisenhower had learned about, had developed this vision while he was Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. He'd seen the rise of Hitler and Stalin, the two guys Obama's compared to now by Glenn Beck. He'd seen what happened in their societies, and especially in Germany, Hitler rose through a democratic process. And so he warned in his letter of those seeking relief of mental stress and the burden which democracy imposes, and those who seek refuge in extremist movements that offer them freedom from the necessity of informing themselves and making up their own minds concerning these tremendous, complex, and difficult questions. At the time, he was under attack from the John Birch Society, the predecessor of these groups we saw on 9/12 on the National Mall. They accused him and most of his cabinet of being Soviet agents. They compared him to Stalin. Joseph McCarthy said the same thing about his Secretary of State. And Eisenhower wanted to guard his party against its right flank, against this incipient right-wing movement. But here we are, and we see a Republican Party that has ignored Eisenhower's warning and realized his worst fears. And with that, I'll take questions.
So I saw the values conference that went on in Washington, and somebody got up and said that pornography causes homosexuality. And I heard this gasp from the crowd, no kidding. Where do they come up with this stuff?
You heard me mention earlier Michael Schwartz, who said, "I want to impale judges." This is the chief of staff to the Republican senator from Oklahoma, Tom Coburn. He's the one who said that. He said, and he actually said, to stop children from using pornography, we should tell them it makes them gay, and that'll work. Mm-hmm. Where they come up with it, I don't know, but I think they, in this instance, realized they've probably failed. I sort of sympathize with them on some level, because if you have kids, you probably don't want them watching pornography, and there's no way to avoid it with the internet and with even MTV. And so they do manage to mobilize a lot of resentment against mainstream culture by attacking pornography. And the American Family Association, for example, advertises a pornography filter. They sell their own pornography filters. It's a big Christian right group in Mississippi, and it's their top fundraising tool, selling this porn filter. And they have commercials on Christian radio where they say, "Save your marriage with our porn filter. Stop web cheating." So, like I said, with Sarah Palin and the facts on what I said were the facts on the ground in Palin country. Pornography is a big problem in Middle America. The state with the highest porn consumption rate is Utah. Oh, it's a two-front war.
My question is about the title of your book, in particular the reference to Gomorrah. I then remember the Robert Bork book that was attacking more of the secular. And so I was wondering why you chose to use that reference in the title.
Well, I looked at Republican Gomorrah and didn't turn into a pillar of salt, so maybe it wasn't Gomorrah after all. But it was originally going to be called Gomorrah, but then there was this book about the mafia that was really popular, and a movie, which was a pretty faithful adaptation of the book. So I just called it Republican Gomorrah, and it's really a reference to the sea of bizarre sex scandals and criminality that exploded out of this supposedly pro-family movement. And yeah, I definitely wanted to play with Robert Bork's book title. And by the way, since you brought up Robert Bork, my first involvement in politics was with Robert Bork. I was in a commercial narrated by Gregory Peck when I was 10 years old that People for the American Way produced against Robert Bork. And you can see it online. And I was attacked by the National Review at 10 years old. They said I looked like Beaver Cleaver. So, over here.
Thanks for the explanation on Palin. I had no idea. But what's the connection with the industrial complex?
The military industrial?
Maybe the military, just all of industry that is now in support of the Republican Party.
Well, I mean, when we, for example,
how did it
Palin
evolve?
was actually just speaking at for a lot of industry titans in Hong Kong, and she blamed the government for the financial crisis and said the financial crisis stemmed from the liberalism and too much regulation, and that if we got the government out of everyone's life, then, and the industry could run rampant, then everything would be just fine and dandy. I want her to run for president. I think a lot of you do because, like me, you love unintentional comedy. But more disturbingly, on 9/12, and you could go to my website, maxblumenthal.com, and see my video from the 9/12 rally on the National Mall. I was interviewing all these teabaggers, asking them about their health insurance. And a lot of them don't have health insurance, but they're rallying against having it. And the man who planned the rally was Dick Armey, the former Republican House Majority Leader, who's a corporate lobbyist for the healthcare industry. So you just see, it's corporations exploiting these very suggestible, resentful people who maybe aren't educated enough to realize who's manipulating them. But they do have, these people are useful tools for corporations. I think Tom Frank got it right in his book, What's the Matter with Kansas, about that.
Hello. I heard your interview with Terry Gross on NPR. Great interview. I was going to ask, you mentioned a character by the name of Lyndon LaRouche on there. If you could touch on that, and also if you've ever had any death threats, or if you see any of this seeping into the Democratic Party. Sorry, I couldn't pick one of those. So, on any of those
see what seeping into the Democratic?
The same kind of doctrine seeping into, Democrats in the Midwest or certain states that are trying to emulate, blue dogs or whatnot, and then and then the last one being if you've ever had death threats with all these things that you're uncovering and also obviously exposing.
I'll take the LaRouche question first, and maybe if I have time to answer the others. But I had written an article about how LaRouche and his cult were the first to compare Obama to Hitler at a meeting of some board in Chicago where they were talking about how congressional funds would be allocated in the state of Illinois and elsewhere. One of LaRouche's top cadres, Anton Chaikin, who writes for his newsletter, somehow got a seat was able to ask a question of the panel. And Ezekiel Emanuel, the brother of the presidential chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, was on the panel. He's the chief bioethicist at NIH. And Chaikin accused Emanuel of having a Hitlerian agenda to write into Barack Obama's health care plan Hitler's T4 program to euthanize the mentally retarded and elderly with very little basis. I mean, Emanuel's spoken out against euthanasia. But then we saw a few months later Sarah Palin on her Twitter account saying Barack Obama's health care plan has death panels in it that will possibly, if this health care plan is passed, people like her her disabled son Trigg would be killed. And Charles Grassley, the ranking Republican on the Senate Finance Committee in charge of negotiating Barack Obama's health care plan, seconded Palin, said his health care plan will pull the plug on grandma. But it really, maybe these people were unaware that LaRouche had introduced this first, but the fact is it started with LaRouche right after the campaign. And as far as death threats, I mean, I've gotten them, but I don't take them very seriously. I don't think I merit them. But anyway, it's better than having my birth certificate challenged. Yeah.
The dialogue is getting extremely extreme. I mean, we can laugh about this, but I feel as though we're losing civility here, and that the fact that the president gets death threats and people are willing to just bring their ignorance out in public and just show it to everybody. And it has a base. I mean, how far do you think this can go? I mean, in terms of will this lead to fistfights in the crowd?
Well, it did. I mean, there's a video that's really disturbing on a website that friends of mine run called One People's Project, and I should post the video on my site, but it's of these three young African-American vendors who are at the National Mall, and they wade into the Tea Party rally to sell flags, and they're suddenly attacked, not physically, but they're surrounded by people calling them Acorn. Acorn! They're Acorn! Because Acorn has become Republican code for black. And it looks like they're going to be attacked physically, and they're terrified, and the Capitol Police show up and escort them out. But, I mean, Nancy Pelosi warned of the Democratic majority leader warns of political violence. I mean, whatever you think of Pelosi, it has to be taken seriously, and it's already happened. In Pittsburgh, a young 20-year-old neo-Nazi named Richard Poplawski, who had been posting Glenn Beck videos of Glenn Beck questioning whether Barack Obama had a plan to create concentration camps for Americans. He was posting these YouTube clips on his account on the neo-Nazi website stormfront.org. Poplawski holed himself up in his mother's house with some high-powered assault weapons, and when the Pittsburgh police SWAT team was called in, he gunned them down. His bullets, he had special bullets that could penetrate bulletproof vests, and he killed, I think, 3 cops. And when he killed himself, his friend was interviewed, his best friend, and he said he was against the government, and he saw those cops as agents of the Obama agenda. I think Glenn Beck should be asked about this and should be held to account for the consequences of his rhetoric. So if the question is whether these things can happen, they already have happened.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello? Okay. Well, I'll be really concise, hopefully, right? I have 2 points. It's very interesting. You're like tracing this intellectual history of like, the Christian fundamentalists and Reconstructionists, right? I mean, the far end, right? They would be Reconstructionists, not necessarily fundamentalists. But I'm wondering if you talk about this in your book, maybe I should buy it and read it, or maybe you can touch on it tonight. It's the importance of this anti-intellectual in America that they seem to have hijacked. I don't know if you're familiar with, the development in the Christian right after the Scopes Monkey trial. I mean, that's a very pivotal moment in the fundamentalists.
Absolutely.
They felt embarrassed. You had Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan fight out, and ever since then, up until the 70s, you saw them in the shadows because of that huge, important battle. And they come back with a vengeance, with this anti-intellectual vengeance.
Yeah, and it took abortion to bring them back out of the pews after that humiliation. And they have this resentment of intellectualism. I remember going to a big rally of Republican women. They call themselves Feminists for Life, but they're actually feminists against feminists at the Republican convention, and Laura Ingraham was just mocking liberals. They think they're so smart, she said. They have so many. Laura Ingram's a big right-wing radio host, by the way. And she went to Dartmouth, so I don't know how she's going to attack elites. And she said these liberals think they're so smart. They think they have so many stamps on their passports, and people booed, as if foreign travel is something so horrible. That's what they think. Know-nothingism is an essential component of the Republican Party today. And know-nothingism is, I think, best defined by the belief that if we rid ourselves of all foreign elements, we'll be living in a utopia. And if we rid ourselves of all intellectual elements, we'll be living in a middle-class utopia. You see it on Lou Dobbs. And Obama is a professor. You never forget that. They hate him also because he's an intellectual, and he has a foreign background. So he's sort of this multicolored piñata of everything they want to smash. There's a good book by Charles Pierce called Idiot America that takes this on. But I definitely talk about it in my book, about especially how Francis Schaeffer and his son Frank became estranged from the Christian right because of the anti-intellectualism and because as Frank Schaeffer said to me, they worship ignorance.
Thank you for taking my question. My name is Karen Cooper. I recently retired from NARAL Pro-Choice Washington, and I really appreciate your comments on abortion, but I'd like you to expound, if you would, on other roles of women and the actual anti-woman approach from the entire religious right and the talks that they do about the biblical role of the family.
Right, right. You said you were with NARAL, right?
Just retired.
Oh, cool. Yeah. My mother came up with the NARAL slogan, "Whose choice, yours or theirs?" I think it was. She wrote it at my grandmother's kitchen table, I remember. But anyway, well, the Christian right, including Rick Warren, believes in women's submission, that women have to submit to their husband's will, and the husband has to demonstrate headship of the home. And in order, in return, women will receive this protection from the man against the ravages of secular society. And unfortunately, that is, well, I won't say unfortunately, I'll just state the fact that that is very appealing to a lot of women. Mike Huckabee and his wife were remarried in a stadium ceremony in 2005, and they were given a covenant marriage. Covenant marriage was legalized first in Louisiana, when Tony Perkins was a legislator there. He's now Dobson's chief lobbyist in Washington. And Huckabee and his wife stood along with thousands of other couples in tuxedos and wedding dresses, and the wife verbally pledged her submission. All the wives verbally pledged their submission to their husband. The only way to break a covenant marriage is by demonstrating to a court 2 years of persistent drunkenness, or proving evidence of abuse. So when you enter into a covenant marriage, you have to actually prove that all of this is happening instead of just stating it as a fact and saying, I want out. Why two people would get into it, let alone women, is beyond me. And it's inspired by R.J. Rushdoony's concept of biblical law, moving into the mainstream. R.J. Rushdoony's chief funder, his sugar daddy, Howard F. Amundsen Jr., who's funding the Discovery Institute here in Seattle and funding the intelligent design movement, and who funded Prop 8 in California, declared in 1985, "My goal is the total integration of biblical law into our everyday lives." And with wifely submission and covenant marriage, we see it happening.
Do you think if an AIDS vaccine came about, do you think the Christian right would oppose it in the same way they opposed the HPV vaccine and Plan B?
That's a good question. I know that if technology to determine whether fetuses were gay or not came about, the Christian right would drop its opposition to abortion. But Rick Warren, on a serious note, to attempt to answer that, Rick Warren has been sort of credited with helping the Christian right move away from Jerry Falwell's belief that AIDS is God's plan for homosexuals, and that the AIDS is sort of a blessing because it helps them evangelize to homosexuals through this, culture of personal crisis that I talk about. But there will always be extreme leaders who don't get the message, and I think there will be factions of the Christian right that might not be so happy about that. But forget about hypothesizing. I mean, we're talking about, you mentioned the HPV vaccine. That vaccine would pretty much eliminate cervical cancer in women if young girls could get it before they become sexually active. But the Christian right's fear was that it would encourage them to have sex because then they didn't fear getting HPV, which is a pretty benign virus to begin with. So the Christian right is officially pro-cancer. And it's not funny because women are dying of cervical cancer and they don't have to be. And they actually have stopped the HPV vaccine from being distributed in some states.
You report from hostile environments. Is your cover blown?
Yeah, you should watch this video I did called Generation Chicken Hawk, where I went to the Republican the College Republican National Convention and asked them all, do you support the war? And they're like, of course we support it. We got to get the terrorists. And I said, well, why aren't you there serving? And then they found out I was who I am. And they made me stand in a corner and wouldn't allow me to film, so I just started doing interpretive dance. And I don't know if you've seen the Beverly Hills Cop movies where Axel Foley gets thrown through the window, but that's basically what they did to me. And, but most of the time, like if I go to the Value Voters Convention, for example, the big Christian right conference in Washington, they're pretty friendly to me and they let me in, and as long as I'm civil, they don't really mind. I mean, what I try to do with my videos especially is just show what people actually think. I don't feel the need to edit them, and they're pretty proud of their views. I mean, it's what partly inspired this book was how open people were and how confessional they were in this movement about why they are the way they are and what they believe. You know, Lou Sheldon, for example, this Christian right anti-gay leader from California, told me on camera that I could become gay at any minute because homosexuality is a spirit that attacks you randomly. You know, I'm like, are you sure that's what you mean? He's like, yeah. So to answer it, it hasn't been that much of a problem.
Thank you for your talk tonight. I was wondering, since you mentioned Erich Fromm early on in the talk too, if you could touch on some of the ideas you got from him, and he's one of my favorite authors as well. And I know that he, on the other side of things, this has been a lot of doom and gloom, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel, but he oftentimes offers some kind of
definitely
other side of the story. So if you could expound upon where you're drawing from both the negative and possibly the potential positive.
Well, there's so much to say about Fromm, and I didn't want to get too deep into his writings in my book because I wanted the book to be accessible. But Fromm's a great writer, and my favorite book of his is Escape from Freedom, which he wrote in 1941. After he fled from Nazi Germany, he was Jewish. He was affiliated with the Frankfurt Group, and he said in this book that, you know, okay, what's happening in fascist Germany is terrible. It's a dictatorship, but the greatest peril for authoritarianism lies in democracies, because those who can't handle freedom in an open, democratic environment, especially one like the United States, which is also multiracial and multireligious, will inevitably flock to authoritarian structures and leaders. And I think he was prophetic. I think he prophesied the rise of the radical right. And so that's just the essential thesis of his book. I consider his book The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, which he wrote in the late 60s, and sort of distills his ideas about the counterculture and the backlash against the counterculture, to be the sequel of Escape from Freedom. And it's a great book because it was written in English and wasn't translated from German, so it's much more readable. And he talks about the necrophilius character, someone who's attracted to death and structures that represent death. And he actually did a study with his partner, Michael Maccoby, on necrophilius tendencies, and he found that those who exhibit, you know, an attraction to death are what he called the racists in our society, those who oppose civil rights, those who want to crush dissenters. And he contrasted that with the biophilius personality, the lover of life, and expanded on that in his book, The Art of Loving, which is his most popular book. It's his ruminations on love, and he talks about two different kinds of love. If I can remember, there's two different kinds of dependence. Benign dependence, which is pretty normal. Husband and a wife come to depend on each other and love each other, and they need each other. And then there's malignant dependence, where someone needs someone like a magic helper. They need someone because they can't get by on their own. And it's sort of an authoritarian form of love that isn't really love at all. So I just think in these contrasts that he draws, you can see a contrast between, the two different directions we can go. And because I think the personal is political, you see the direction you can go personally, but you see the direction a movement made up of people, of like-minded people, can go, who have these different characteristics. And I think right now, and I say it in my book, the Republican Party is It's a necrophilious party. The Democratic Party is not a biophilious party. But the Republican Party, with the Pastor Hagees, the Sarah Palins, the people, the warmongering of Dick Cheney, is a necrophilious party that is filled with people who exhibit malignant dependence on leaders, including Glenn Beck. I'm sure you could say a lot more about Fromm. I wonder what you think about my answer, but
I thought it was great because he's a big web of ideas, and I thought that was a nice boiled-down version. So.
Yeah, I still need to get more into some of his other books, and I also talk about Eric Hoffer, who's a fascinating character who Eisenhower cited in the letter I mentioned. Hoffer's True Believers is such a great book because you can breeze right through it, but still pick up so many ideas from so many religious and philosophical traditions, including Fromm. You know, Hoffer was a self-educated dock worker, and his essential idea in this book is faith in a holy cause is really a substitute for lost faith in ourselves.
I wondered if you'd expand a little bit more on the personal as political, because, you know, I remember back in the 70s, you know, how they had all the, I think that this whole reemergence of the religious wackos was a political from the beginning, you know, and that, because I remember all the stealth campaigns, and I remember all the letters that they sent out to people, you know, to find out, you know, who was interested in abortion, who was, right, you know, worried about school prayer and all these things, and they targeted all these people for fundraising and basically to form this movement, which was artificial.
Absolutely. I mean, they only comprise about 12% of the population, but they're able to exert a disproportionate influence because they're so effective and they're so politically determined, because their goal is to bring Jesus back one way or another. I think our goal is to have, like, the public option. So just one example of what you're talking about, how culture translates and the personal translates into the political. James Dobson has a correspondence department at Focus on the Family, which is so large, it handles so much mail and so many phone calls a day that it has its own zip code in Colorado Springs. And I visited it, and people will ask for Dobson-approved advice on their child's bedwetting problem, on marital strife, on alcoholism, pornography addiction, and they get the advice. And they're given, like, long, extensive phone counseling sessions, too. But once they're entered into the database, they're bombarded with political mailings, and they're targeted by Dobson, and they're slowly transformed into Republican shock troops. Visiting there is how I realized that there is this culture of personal crisis behind, you know, the histrionics and resentment of the right, and that, like the feminists, they believe that the personal is political, and I think they're correct.
Are you a parent? Do you have children?
No, I don't. Not that I know of.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anything else to? Oh, okay.
2
Someday.
years of political weirdness should suffice.
Yeah. This is my baby. You know.
I just would like to hear you comment on whether we needed 8 years of George W. Bush to get to Barack Obama. And the second question is, what's become of the moderate Republicans?
Good question. I mean, that's a huge issue in my book. What happened to the moderate Republicans? I mean, the answer to your first question is yes. I mean, besides discrediting the Republican brand, George Bush was the first Southern conservative Republican president in history, which means he was probably the whitest president in history in the racialist sense of white, and it's why he had to surround himself with people like Colin Powell and Condi Rice to overcompensate for that, or Claude Allen, who I talk about in my book, who went down on a shoplifting charge after being the highest paid White House advisor Bush had. Bush, I mean, it really took Bush to, to convince Americans that maybe we needed to seek another kind of leader, someone dramatically different from this man who, you know, really in so many ways comes from the Confederacy and from a party that was controlled by the neo-Confederate wing of the party. And Joseph Wilson, he's the hero of the Republican Party right now. His top political consultant is a man named Richard Quinn, who in 1983 wrote that he wrote in a white supremacist magazine that Martin Luther King was the worst person, the worst leader that African Americans could ever have. He showed up in a Confederate uniform at a rally for John McCain in 2000. I mean, these are the people that are, populating the narrowing ranks of the Republican Party. And meanwhile, the moderates are gone. Olympia Snowe, the Republican senator from Maine, 4 days ago said, "It's not my party anymore." She's one of the last moderates left. I mean, Chris Shays is gone in Connecticut. Christy Todd Whitman's gone. Lincoln Chafee changed parties and called Sarah Palin a cocky wacko. And one of the best statistical examples of the demise of moderate republicanism, Christy Todd Whitman pointed out in her book, It's My Party Too, her wrongly titled book, that John McCain in 2008 won 3% more of conservative Republican votes than George W. Bush, a hardcore conservative, did in 2004. And at the same time, McCain received 20% less of moderate Republican votes than Bush did in 2004, when McCain was typically seen as a moderate Republican. So all the moderates have, at least for now, have gone to the Democratic side. Hi.
Could you comment on the house on C Street?
Well, a lot of the characters I mentioned, Sanford and Ensign, and also Chip Pickering, who I wrote about for the Daily Beast. And that's a fascinating story that I won't have time to tell. But they all lived in this house on C Street on Capitol Hill together, and they covered up each other's affairs. And Chip Pickering actually conducted his affair in the house. And this is a house dedicated to, evangelical conservative fellowship and prayer. But it's actually sort of a Christian right frat house. Another member, Tom Coburn, who I mentioned before, knew about John Ensign's affair for 18 months and said nothing, and was present when Ensign was confronted by the mistress's husband. And he said, "How could you do this to me?" And Coburn obviously showed no sympathy for the husband. His sympathy was with his brother and his frat brother in C Street House. And it's affiliated with this group that Jeff Charlotte writes about in his book, The Family, which I, can't really speak about, but, Charlotte's been out there talking about that. It's bizarre, but the scandals just keep coming, and next week there'll be more scandals. I don't know if they'll be having anything to do with C Street, but they managed to keep the news of these scandals out of the media by networking together in this little mafia. And they call the family the Christian mafia. So.
Thank you. Well, this story is, of course, not over, and so I'd like you to think ahead a little bit, given the trajectory and the fact that the success of the people that you're talking about and the consolidation around fear and loathing that you've described is only going to become more powerful as time goes on, as long as the federal government, most governments are ineffective at carrying forward their program, which so far the right has been able to do, even if only by keeping the moderate Republicans from pulling away from what they perceive to be their last base. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. It's hard to really project where the movement's going to go, and it's a very amorphous movement. You see a confluence of anti-government people who echo a lot of what we heard from the militia movement in the 90s with Christian right shock troops on the National Mall. It's, I think, hard to quite project what it's going to do, except that it will maintain a vice grip on the Republican Party. One example of that is that Mitt Romney, Bobby Jindal, and Haley Barbour, 3 governors who are going to run for the presidency in 2012, who are very conservative, especially Jindal, who wrote about how he participated in an exorcism while in college, formed a group called the National, I think it's the Association for National Action, something like that. And they started a website, and they said they were going to go on a listening tour, and they listed all of their, their program, which is sort of like their contract for America, and it didn't include any mention of homosexuality or abortion, and they immediately came under attack from Rush Limbaugh and Tony Perkins from the Family Research Council in Washington. They scrubbed their program and canceled their listening tour. These are like three powerful governors kowtowing to Rush Limbaugh. I mean, we see anyone who criticizes Limbaugh. Last week, Rush Limbaugh suggested there should be segregated school buses. This was after Michael Steele, the African-American chairman of the Republican Party, came whimpering to Rush Limbaugh and apologized to him for merely calling him an entertainer. So the right wing will control the Republican Party well into the future. Sarah Palin will remain a folk hero. But you mentioned the ineffectiveness of the federal government. One of their greatest fears is that the health care plan will pass with a public option because it will weaken what I refer to in my book as their crisis industry. So many personal crises stem from health care costs and health care problems. And if the federal government starts going in and improving people's lives, that's a huge threat to the Christian right's ability to evangelize those who are experiencing anxiety and trauma. It's why it would be also a disaster if Obama signed a bill that had mandates in it that required everyone under 30 in here to pay $1,000 of their salary to buy health care, and a family would have to pay about $4,000, $5,000 for health care, while with no public option to make health care costs competitive with private companies. It would be a disaster, and I've heard from a conservative friend who's a pretty major radio host that that's what the Republicans want. They want that bill to pass because they can still mobilize resentment against Obama while the bill fails to improve anyone's lives.
This is all very disturbing. I guess my question, too, to build on the previous question or comment, is what do we do to counter this and keep the faith and slow down? I mean, is there any hope for us to, because it's very scary and they're very effective in getting their message out. So how do we counter that effectively?
Well, I think they're always going to be there, and they've demonstrated a lot of effectiveness even as just a small contingent of the population. But their failure, I think, is their failure to realize their own limitations and to be self-reflective. I think imitating a lot of the tactics of the Christian right just on a tactical level, just how they train people at the school board level and move them up through government, and their devotion to politics. And they don't fear power, unlike many people on the left who fear power because the left and people who are part of the left, minorities and gays especially, and women have been victims of power. But people on the left have to realize that read my book and see what the Christian right has done. And some of these tactics can be emulated while realizing, the progressive movement has to realize its own limitations within the system we have and to be self-reflective, or else they'll go the way of this movement, which has really marginalized its ability to exert its influence at a legislative level. As far as what we do, too, I mean, this is a critique. I'm a journalist, and I have trouble offering prescriptions and solutions, so I'm sorry if I'm too gloomy. Well, I'll take one more, I guess.
So I guess in most countries in Europe, there's maybe a fringe element of about 10% of the population. It seems to be ultra-right and anti-government. But here it seems much more powerful. So what is this an accident of history, or what do you think is the reason?
Yeah, that's a question that a historian might be more qualified to answer. But this country, I'm not going to really go there, although I could. I don't think I'm going to be able to give a clear answer, but clearly we're different from one of the things that makes us different from Europe. Just one thing is that our democracy puts more pressure on individuals and our political system is more chaotic, our society is more diverse, and there's been more cultural tumult here, and I think it's what makes me enjoy living in the United States, is the chaos and tumultuous environment. But of course, we have like a religious tradition that was formed by a lot of people who were kicked out of Europe because they were considered fanatics, and they've formed the basis of the Christian right. And I encourage you guys to all come up with solutions, because I don't really have any, but I think you've been incredible with your questions, and I'll be signing books. And afterwards, we'll be at... Dave, where are we going to be after? With drinking? Pike Place Ale House with drinking liberally, so come drink liberally.